If there is one thing I know, is that every filmmaker teaching how to achieve the cinematic look is doing it wrong. If you go to YouTube and search for cinematic color grading, there are literally thousands of videos that will teach you their way to achieve cinematic in their preferred tool, their preferred workflow.
Awesome cinematic color grading.
Getting the cinematic look.
Simple cinematic look in Davinci Resolve.
This is how you can color grade your video footage to look like film.
Virtually all of us are looking for a more cinematic aesthetic.
And they are all failing to teach it. At the end, there is no secret recipe for the cinematic look. Color grading should support the story you're telling and the character journey. Now, there are certain characteristics that the color treatment of a movie can evoke the analog and celluloid look, which can somehow trigger feelings and emotions in the audience, like for example, film compression, film grain, halation, bloom, film damage, film breath, gate wave, overscan, print toning, and so much more. So what if I told you there is an agnostic cross-platform practical tool that can enable you to easily achieve most of these looks with full control and consistent results? Well, that's what Dehancer promises. Dehancer is a film color grading plugin for any video editing software, which is based on 30 years of film shooting and darkroom experience combined with scientific approach and non-linear image processing, or at least that's what they say on their website. So let's review together this tool and see if it actually delivers. I'm Kevin Blanco, certified editor and colorist, and we are about to get serious and technical about the film look. But before we dive into the details on how to use Dehancer, let me show you a final result graded with Dehancer of a documentary film I'm working on.
Costa Rica. Costa Rica.
Costa Rica. Yeah! Nambe. South America. Nambe, Costa Rica. Hey, yeah! Baka.
僕たちの声が世界の端っこまで消えることなく届いたりしたらいいのにな。そしたらね、二人でどんな言葉を放とう、消えることない約束を二人でせーので言おう。出発点終点とこの命果てる場所に何かがあるっていつも言い張っていた。いつか行こうぜ生命も身と磨いたくの感情にハイタッチして時間にキスを5次元にからかわれてそれでも君を見るよ。また初めまして君 よ
Alright, here I am in Davinci Resolve 18.6, and if you want to know how to install Dehancer and configure it on Davinci Resolve, there is a separate video I just put on my channel, which is just focused on downloading, installing and configuring Dehancer. I already have it configured and my licensed key is on, so for this project I just have 2 shots. And we'll learn everything about Dehancer using these 2 shots. They're very different between each other. The first one is shot with the iPhone using the Blackmagic Cinema Camera app in the iPhone, using Apple ProRes 422 and Apple Log. And as you can see, it's just a shot of my wife walking on the cemetery. It's on Mexico, the last trip we made. And today is very foggy. And for this shot, I'm expecting to give it a look that is more dark, a more cold type of colors, and you know, a bit of mysterious. For the second shot that I have here, this one is shot on the Blackmagic Cinema Camera. It's recorded with BRAW 8.1, and for this one we recorded in Japan, and it's also my wife. Just, you know, it's a very standard shot, nothing too crazy, just her walking down to the camera, and that's it. For this second shot, I'm expecting something more warm, something to be more futuristic, more Japan style, you know, something that gives more happiness in the result. So let's see if I can achieve what I'm expecting with Dehancer, and let's learn what I know so far about Dehancer, and let's explore this tool together. That at the end, that's what I'm expecting of this tutorial. So the first thing is the project's configuration. So let's go to our project configuration and go to the color management. Now, I haven't done any changes to the default settings in Davinci Resolve. I'm just going to keep the master settings as they are. It's just a 4K video. I'm not going to change anything. But on the color management, I'm going to go with the default recommended configuration from Dehancer. This is the simple configuration they recommend that you work in your project. And the first thing is that you change to Davinci YRGB color managed, turn off the automatic color management, and then select HDR Davinci Wide Gamut Intermediate. That's what they recommend to work with. And then for the output color space, you can define whatever output color space you want for your project. Normally, since I'm on Mac and I normally deliver to Rec 709, I normally select Rec 709 Gamma 2.4 because that's the way I avoid gamma shifting from the Apple operative system. But that's my preference over there. You can define whatever output color space you want. And for the color processing mode, this is what Dehancer recommend. Now, you could do it differently. You can, in your node graph, define whatever pre-processing node you want. You can use color space transform to transform it to a different color space to work with, a wide gamut or what have you. And then at the end, you can do another color space transform to transform it to any other color space that you want, maybe Rec 709 or any other one that you need, depending on the type of project you have and the type of file you're working with. So that's up to you, but this is the recommendation from Dehancer. So I'm just gonna go with that because this is like our first interaction with Dehancer together, okay? So as soon as I change it, we should be able to see some changes because right now we're working with that specific wide gamut and Rec 709 Gamma 2.4 for the output color space. Now you could do it differently, like I said. You can have your color changes, your color space transform, what have you, and do it differently. Now let's add a new node, and on this node is where I'm going to be adding Dehancer. That's going to be my final node. So let's select that node and let's find Dehancer, which normally is at the very end under the film emulation category. Let's drag and drop, and we should see some of the preferences as soon as we drag and drop, and we should see also some changes on the footage. Now it looks weird, so let's change some stuff. The first thing is our input source. That depends on whatever you are making changes at the beginning. So if you are making changes on your color space transform, That's what you have to select here as your source. Normally, what I do for the iPhone is choose camera and then tell Dehancer that I'm using my Apple iPhone and then Apple lock. So I already can see some changes in the way it looks, so we will have to tweak it to make it look the way we want. Normally what I have seen is when we define Dehancer, normally the film profile is going to be selected by default and it's going to be enabled by default. Now, depending on the profile, that's going to have an impact on how the film looks. So normally I disable it, I make changes to it, and then at the very end I select a profile that doesn't require any change on temperature or things like that. So we'll talk about that later on, but normally I like to disable the film profile because it can impact negatively or positively or on the colors that you're making. So I will say turn it off and let's define the way we want it to look first before we apply any film profile to it. Now, this is my personal preferences. That doesn't mean that you have to do it that way, but I found that if I keep this enabled, I start making changes on the way it looks, on the temperature, the exposure, etc. And then when I change to another private profile, you'll see that everything changes. And that's because the profile can implement very big changes on the way that our film looks. As you can see, this one is more bright, more warm, a bit more saturated, but if we select any other profile, it's going to look completely different. So I would say make the changes, make it look the way you want without the film profile, and then we can select the profile. So I'm turning off profile, we'll go back there and let's make our changes happen in the footage in the way that I want. So one question you might have is, should I make the changes in terms of exposure, temperature, tint, and other values in my previous node using the default Davinci Resolve preferences or settings for those specific values, or should I use the ones from Dehancer? And my recommendation is that you should use Dehancer if you're going to be applying Dehancer. Don't use the Davinci Resolve ones, because the way that Dehancer is made is going to be applying film corrections in the algorithm they have implemented. So I will say my recommendation is use those controls for that specific thing in terms of exposure, temperature, tint, and then the deep fringe. So the first thing is the exposure composition. This is a technical correction of the original image before any Dehancer effects are applied. Conversely, print exposure is rather a creative setting, and the result of which largely depend on the selected profile, print media, and other settings within the plugin. Exposure compensation is technically applied with the source color conversion. Therefore, it might produce better results than adjusting exposure with the conventional Davinci Resolve. And the only exception is RAW, in which it's better to make basic exposure compensations in the Davinci Camera RAW panel. So in this case, since we're not working with a RAW file, it's an Apple ProRes, the recommendation from them is use the control on Dehancer. So my shot is a bit underexposed after we enable Dehancer, so I'm going to be exposing a little bit, but I don't want to clip on the highlights. I'm just going to keep it there. And as you can see, we have a big contrast in our shot. So we're going to be reducing the contrast in some other portions here of the settings that we're going to be looking at. For example, here in the print, we can reduce our contrast or extend our contrast, and then we can make other changes on the exposure, so we avoid clipping on the highlights and also on the shadows. Now again, this is a very creative process. If this shot is extended to be a bit mysterious and it's in a cemetery, so maybe we will keep it closer to the shadows, but obviously we don't want to clip on the shadows and not much on the highlights. The temperature, again, we can change a little bit on the temperature to make it colder or warmer. Since again, I'm looking for something that is more mysterious, I might reduce it a little bit. And then we have the tint, depending on if you want to make it more to the reds or more to the greens. That's up to you and your creative process. I will make it more to the green, just a little bit. And then the fringe, which helps to deal with the chromatic variations visible at the edges that might interfere with some of the dehancer effects, such as halation and bloom. So we'll go back to the fringe once we apply bloom and halation. For now, I'm just going to keep it like that. Then we have the film developer. Here we can, if we enable it, and once we enable it, we should see some changes. We can increase or decrease the contrast. Again, this can help to decrease the contrast. I'm actually going to be using this to decrease the contrast and have more information in the mid-tones. And that way we're not clipping the shadows or the highlights around that. And then I can go back again to my exposure. I'm not going to decrease it that much, just a little bit, something like that. And then gamma correction, that depends if you need some gamma correction or not. Then we have the color separation, which is, in negative film is determined by the color filters in the emulsion layers. And, in Dehancer you can control the chemical component of the developer, which affects the sensitization of the emulsion layers. So when you decrease this value, saturation of the most intense colors is reduced first, while medium and low saturation colors remain almost unaffected. So again, that depends on your settings or whatever you want to achieve. But normally I just keep it the way it is. And then color boost, I normally don't touch this too much, but if you want to have more saturation or an increase in colors and the intensity on the colors, you can use these settings. But since again this shot is more intended to be mysterious, more cold type of shot, I'm gonna actually reduce the color boost, because for example this blue little cemetery house, it's too much bluer, and also the red one next to it where you have this cross over here. So I'll actually like to reduce the color boost on this specific shot. If you are finding Dehancer to be a great tool for your workflow, as I do, use the Mr. White discount code at checkout and get a 10% discount on all other different Lextop licenses. Take advantage of the discount while it lasts and get this amazing tool. Now let's go to film compression. So it turns out that in negative film, clipping in the highlights occurs much later than on digital camera. So to emulate the film-like compressed tone range, Dehancer invented this film compression tool, which lets you fine-tune the redistribution of the highlights, and the resulting image will look more analog and becomes more flexible for the further manipulation of the exposure, contrast, film print profiles, etc. So if you enable the film compression, this is going to be affecting a lot on the highlights mostly. So once you start increasing the impact, you should see some of the changes on the highlights. So for example, here in the sky, this is a very foggy day, so there's a lot of maybe clipping or highlights on the sky. So what I'm going to be doing, if we increase it, we should see that some information is recovered on the highlights in the sky. Also, you can define the white point for this specific preference. Also changing it depends on what you want. The tonal range, if you want it to be increased, you will see how in the scopes the highlights are going to be reduced more to the midtones. Again, that's up to you. For this particular case, I'm not going to increase it too much, but I do want to increase it a little bit because I don't want the sky to be super sunny for this foggy day. I don't want it to take too much information or too much importance on the shot. I actually want to focus more on the cemetery rather than the sky. And then the color density for the film compression, again, this is more in the highlights only. And again, changing the color density will have more saturation maybe of the colors, or more boost on the colors in the highlights specifically. I think I'm gonna keep it like that. It's looking pretty nicely. Let me reproduce it a little bit as my wife is walking, and yeah, the shot is looking the way that I want. It looks like an actual maybe horror film, like something's gonna happen to her. Maybe something's gonna jump over her. Alright, now the expand tool. This tool basically provides a separate manual control for the black and the white points in relation to the output color space. All films naturally have different contrast, different black and white points, and at the sampling stage, Dehancer avoids digital correction to preserve the individual features of the film, which ensures a fair and convincing simulation. Thus, film profiles in Dehancer without additional adjustments usually lack of contrast, but at the same time they have a lot of headroom for creative adjustments. So Dehancer recommend adjusting the expand immediately after applying a film profile selection. So right now I'm not actually going to be touching the expand until we select a film profile if we do. But just understand that as you can see, the black point is going to be either clipping in the shadows or actually increasing to the highlights, and also the white point is going to be impacting those values. But again, we're going to go back to this expand section once we define a film profile. Now the print section, I'm not going to go into much details about print because we can get very technical about the analog process and production, but normally the optical printing is the last step or the last stage of the analog production. So optical printing is the only analog solution that can be used for proper interpretation of the negative film. So here we define basically what that interpretation is going to be. So it's going to be linear or cine on film log, or if we're going to be using a Kodak 2383 print film or a glossy paper. Normally I keep it to linear. To be honest, I normally don't change it unless there isn't a specific definition, and as you can see, if we change it, there's going to be a direct impact on the results. So I'm just going to keep it to linear, and I can do some changes on the exposure, the tonal contrast, and the density. And again, the print is going to be the last step of the or the last stage of the analog production. Now let's talk about the color head. Now in this portion, what we're going to be is changing the print toning. CMY, color head is based upon the analog color correction tool, which is integrated in photo enlargers. The similar method is used in printer lights. A special device for optical movie printing to a positive film is applied. Now both have the same principle, which is just changing the color of light used for print exposure. In the Dehancer tool, the color head is represented with three complementary color pairs: the CMC BGR, or commonly used CMY RGB. So combining these both analog devices in one single tool. In long story short, there all you have to do, or you can do, is just changing the tone of the light. So if you want to give it a more yellow or bluish tones, you will change it here once you enable it, obviously. So as you can see, I don't know if you want to give it like more Mexican sepia colors or more blue tones, you can change it here. I was telling you that I want a more bluish tone, but I don't want to overuse it, so maybe I can just move it a little bit. And then you have the magenta or green tones. I'm just gonna keep it to 0, or cyan and red. I can put it maybe a little bit to the cyan, but I don't want to overuse it, to be honest. And then you have shadows tones, midtones, and highlight tones. You can increase those tones here. That means the tone of the colors in those specific levels, the shadows, the midtones, and the highlights. And if you want to preserve the exposure and the impact values, you can decrease it or just keep it to 100. I'm not going to be touching this, to be honest. Because as you can see, we're going to have a direct impact on how the color is going to look like. It looks nice to me the way it is right now, but again, this is a tool, and depending on the type of creative process you're going through your film, you can use these capabilities to increase the tones on these values and also the colors on the specific heads. I think, to be honest, I like the way it is like this. I don't want to touch the highlights because we have the film compression in it, so actually I'm going to keep it like that. And I don't want to go too much into the midtones because it looks like we're increasing a lot on the greens, and I actually don't want the green grass on this image to take too much importance. So actually I think I'm gonna keep it like that. Alright, now one of the most used preferences for cinematic look is the film grain. And here you can apply a film grain, which is not just an overlay on the top of the image, but in fact, the image itself is entirely consistent of the grain. Dehancer literally reconstructs the shot using the local color and brightness characteristics, along with a complex physical modeling of film emulsion. So, it's not just a layer on the top, and you can see that after you start changing the profile in the game, you will see that, for example, higher ISO values are going to be more noticeable in the image. So for example, if we select, I don't know, 8 millimeters ISO 500, you can see that the image changes a lot. The grain is very noticeable. In my personal opinion, depending on the ISO and your image, and depending how much grain-ish you want it, that's up to you. But for me, 35 millimeters ISO 50 is just subtle. And you can also change the amplification of those grain values. So for example, I can select 250, but also I can decrease the amount of grain applied at that specific millimeters and that specific ISO value. So for example, lower ISOs can be less noticeable, but you can increase the amount of grain, and still is going to be very noticeable if you increase the amount. Normally, I don't like to overuse it. People think that if you apply too much grain, it's going to be more cinematic, and honestly, I think that looks good to me. I don't want to overuse the grain, to be honest. Now we have the halation, the famous halation, which is a film emulsion effect that is visible mostly on the red or orange images or colors, because you will see like a halo around those colors light sources, and specular highlights and contrasting edges. Also, halation might produce a well-pronounced red glare in the midtones, mostly affecting the skin tones. Honestly, on this specific image that we're looking at right now, I don't think we will be able to see halation impact, because we don't have a lot of lights coming from light sources, like for example street lights or something like that. So I honestly don't think we will see any type of changes in the way we do the halation. But in the next shot, which is the one on Japan, we will probably see the halation effect on some of the red colors. And here you can define also what type of profile for the halation you want: 35 millimeters super 35, 16 millimeters super 65. That depends on your configuration, but normally I like to use 35 millimeters as well. Then you have the bloom. So the bloom is basically a emulation of the combined effect of light dispersion on the boundaries of contrasting image areas, which originates in the optical system and then is amplified in the emulsion layers. So you will notice that bloom has little in common with optical soft effects, and it appears only around the light sources. Again, in this specific shot, I don't think you will see a lot of noticeable on the bloom, but I like to enable it because it gives a nice cinematic look. But again, don't overuse it because it's going to look weird. Then you have film damage. Honestly, film damage can be very noticeable in the shot, to be honest. So when you enable it, and you can control the amount, and you play your video, you will see the damage on the shot. You will see like the artifacts of the damage. This is something very standard effect on all cinematic films. And again, it depends on the look that you want to give to your audience. If you're maybe taking your audience back to something that happened in the past, or some sort of movie that people are watching on your movie, that's up to you. I honestly don't like to overuse it on my shots because it's a very subtle effect that can be applied to a specific film. So honestly, film damage, only use it if you really need it, but the option is there. Okay, now the film damage. Naturally, in the way that film was emulsive, dust, hair, scratches, stains, and irregularities normally appears inevitability in those type of films, and that's the natural dirt that enhances the impression of film. Now you can emulate film damage on your film. Those characteristics will be applied, and you can define the amount of, if you want to control the jitter on how those specific artifacts are going to be displayed on the shot. Honestly, I don't like to overuse this unless I really need it to support the story of the character, or maybe the character is looking at past films, so you can apply film damage to your film if that supports the story. But again, that's up to you, it's just a tool. For this particular shot, I'm not going to be enabling film damage, but I wanted you to know that the artifact is there, you can enable it, and you can also control the amount of jitter if you want to look like super crazy or just a very subtle film damage effect. So I'm going to turn it off. Okay, now the film breath. The film breath effect is an accidental change in exposure, contrast, and color from frame to frame as the film moves. It's caused by an uneven emulsion coating of the development, instability of the camera shutter, and other deviations. Film breath greatly affects the viewer's experience in terms of the analog feeling, and normally I try to apply it but reduce the impact, so it's not super noticeable. Again, I normally tend to take every change very subtly and start increasing it and seeing the results and see if it actually supports the story you're trying to tell. Don't just enable it, put it to full, and that's it. No, actually try each of the options separately and depending to your taste or what you need. But honestly, for the film breath, I normally enable it and keep it very low, around 30%. So it's not super noticeable, because sometimes you can see the changes impacting on the actual film. Then we have the gate wave. So the gate wave stands for a mechanical swinging of a film strip while it's being pulled through the frame window of the film camera, projector, or video coding device, and it's often simulated intentionally to breathe life into a digital cinema. In my opinion, but again, this is just my personal opinion, is very noticeable, and I honestly don't like the way it looks. But again, depending on what you want to achieve with your film, you might enable it or not, but in my opinion, gate wave can be very noticeable. Also, if you enable it, you can decrease the amount of gate wave being applied to your film. But again, the tool is there, you can use it if you want it, but in my opinion, I don't like the way it looks in my films. Doesn't mean that it's a bad tool from Dehancer, it just means that I personally don't enjoy it. Then you have the overscan. Now the overscan, honestly, is just a tool that you can use in very specific motions or very specific pieces of your film, because once you enable it, you will see the actual motion picture film is scanned at the top of your film. And again, you can change the different configurations. So for example, if you want to give it, like, for example, I don't know, some sort of credits of the beginning of your film, you can apply this effect, the overscan. But to be honest, it's something very specific for some cases. It looks nice though, like it gives that film look, but I don't think you're going to be applying this to most of your shots, maybe very specific cases. But the tool is there and it's pretty cool. You can change the type and you will see how it changes in each of the different types. You can change the gate shape, the exposure, the scale, and also the defocus. But again, I think this is just a very specific case scenario where you will be using the overscan. And last but not least, you have the vignette. The vignette is it is a very specific effect on film, and you can apply it with Dehancer. To be really honest, I haven't found the vignette controls to be super useful. In my opinion, it sometimes can be really strong. You can control the size of it, the feather, the aspect ratio, and then where the center is going to be. You can define if the center to be more on up or down or left or right, depending on the X and Y axis. But to be really honest, I found that Davinci Resolve Studio Vignette can be way better than the one that comes from Dehancer, but the results are not that bad. I just think that it's very feathered. Although I can reduce the featheredness, I still think that it has a lot of feather, and you know, I honestly think that the results from Davinci Resolve Vignette, it's way better. And the last options are monitor, output, and loop generator, and some options. Monitor, I'm not gonna go in depth into this because I honestly don't know what it is. The output is how much of the impact of all of the Dehancer settings we have made you want to be applied. You can decrease the entire impact of the changes we have done. It can be applied in less amount. I'm just gonna keep it to 100. And then loop generator, you can generate a lot based upon all of the changes we have made. This can be useful, to be honest. It can be very useful to apply to multiple shots that you have, or even you can put this lot in your camera directly and you can see the lot directly on your camera, so that can be super useful. And then you have final options, which is the quality. Normally when I'm gonna be rendering, I change it to high, which can be slower, so when you're editing you want to keep it to normal because it's faster. But when you are you know, exporting your video, I normally try to change it to high so it has a better quality. And here you can see all of the information about your licenses, your profiles, etc. Now let's go back to the profiles, which is like the last portion I normally enable. Let me find the profile here. To be honest, sometimes I don't even choose a profile. I can give the look that I want based upon all of the controls we have seen. And actually, to be honest, I think this one looks nice to what I'm trying to achieve. But still, you can enable it and choose any type of profile that you want. Some can be very obtrusive or impact a lot on the film. Some others normally are not. In my personal opinion, I like a lot this one, the Kodak Supra 100. I think it's very subtle, and you can also define how much is going to be impacting. You can pull and push the impact of this film profile. In my opinion, again, this one I like a lot. I normally use this one, to be honest, but you can try any of the ones that you want. Like I said, some of them can be very obtrusive or change a lot in the way it looks and require more changes in the exposure, in the black points and the white points. But that's a very creative process depending on the type of film profile you want to choose. So I think that's it for this iPhone shot, and actually let's take a look at the final result now. Honestly, I like the result, you know. Let's give it a shot on the second one. So this is the one we shot with the Blackmagic cinema camera in Japan. And let's add a node and bring the Dehancer to that node. So once we enable it, again, looks pretty weird. I'm gonna go much faster on this one because we went through all of the settings in the first shot. So this one is gonna be a bit faster. So the first thing I do is disable the film profile that goes at the end, at least for me, and then check the source. Now this source is not Rec 709 because we are using Blackmagic RAW. Now, there are certain options. The first one is, if you didn't go in the route that we show at the beginning, which is changing the master color settings to HDR wide gamut intermediate, then you will have to do a camera selection. Select the Blackmagic camera and then the Pocket 4K, which is the one that I use, and the format in this case is film. But it looks super weird because that's happening because we change the master settings to use HDR wide gamut intermediate. So if that's what we change, that's also the source. So in this case, we have to change to Davinci Resolve wide gamut intermediate. And as you can see, the results are a bit more natural. So we have a good starting point here. I can start working on my exposure. In my opinion, the colors are fine. Maybe what I can do is increase the contrast a little bit in the future. Then we have the temperature. Honestly, this one I'm gonna be pushing a bit further on the warmish tones, but still I want the sky to be a little bit blue. We can do some changes in a previous layer if we want to, but for now I'm just gonna keep it like this. The tint, again, depends on what you want to achieve. Now contrast boot. Let me enable the film developer. I don't want to increase too much the contrast because I don't want this to be super contrasted. And I'm going to increase the exposure because I'm getting close to clipping the shadows down there. And I don't want that to happen. And then color boost. I do want to boost the color on this one because we're in Japan and those buildings are beautifully red. So I do want to boost a little bit the colors. As you can see, we are a lot on the blues here, so maybe we can add more temperature. So we reduce those blue tones, but that's primarily the sky, so also I don't want to reduce it too much. And then we have the film, which we're going to be enabling at the end. Actually, let me enable the film right away and use the Supra one again, which is one of the ones that I usually enjoy a lot. Now film compression. Yes, I do want to enable film compression because the sky is a little bit in the high tones. The white point, the tonal range, don't want to impact that too much. And the color density, I do want to increase a little bit of the density so we get a better tone on the blue sky. And it's looking pretty sharp, to be honest. I really like the way it's looking. The print, again, we can work on the exposure in this one. Don't want to go too high, maybe actually reduce it a little bit like that. Tonal contrast. Gonna add a bit of tonal contrast. Color density, I don't want to touch it because I don't want to go super in depth with the boost of the colors. Now color head, let's actually reduce a little bit on the blues. Magenta or green, I'm actually gonna go more to the magenta colors for those buildings, which looks pretty nice. And then cyan or red, I'm actually going to increase a bit on the reds. Now I don't want this to be highly saturated because honestly people think that when you go super saturated that's like a film look, but since we're in Japan and we have a lot of colors in those beautiful buildings, I do want to highlight that. And also the trees are really nice. We have green trees, we have some that are a little bit reddish, so I do want to, you know, bring more of that information into my shot. I do going to be touching the shadows, but not too much, maybe like that, midtones, and then the highlights I'm actually going to reduce a little bit. Now film grain, again going to be using 50 because I don't want to overuse too much. Let's keep it to 250 and reduce it a little bit. Halation, let's enable it and actually push it a little bit further. Not super noticeable because we don't have light sources, so we're not going to be able to see a lot of the halation in place. Bloom, definitely this one is going to be looking really nicely in this shot. Film damage, I'm not going to enable it again. I don't think it looks too good, but it's up to you. Film breadth, yes, let's enable film breadth, but not too much, maybe around 40%. Gate wave, not really, and overscan, not really, also not vignette. And I think that's fine. I mean, the result is pretty nice. To be honest, I don't disagree with the fact that you can push this on a much further step and actually make it look extremely cinematic for most of the people, but still give you the ability and the tool to make it look nicely. So yeah, let me export this one and show it to you right away. So after this deep dive into Dehancer and exploring its capabilities, I would like to know your feedback in the comments in this video. But I can confidently say that it delivers what it promises, of enabling filmmakers like you and me to achieve an authentic cinematic look with impressive control and consistency across platforms. However, as I emphasized at the beginning, the true power of color grading, I believe, lies in its ability to support your story and the character arcs. And I do think that Dehancer excels in this realm after, exploring it and seeing all of the wealth of customization options that allows to create a distinct visual language. I do believe that complements all of the arsenal that we can have as a filmmaker. And I think that results speak for themselves. I mean, you saw the example I made, and I'm making this feature documentary film that is very long, and it's actually enabling me to achieve a consistent cinematic look across different shots on different cameras and different days. And honestly, the journey to this powerful tool, I do believe, is an invaluable investment in your artistic growth. Now again, remember, the cinematic look is not just about emulating the past, it's about harnessing the power of visual storytelling to connect with your audience on a visceral way. And Dehancer is just a tool to make that happen. So again, if you want to give it a shot and actually get Dehancer, there is this 10% discount code Mr. White. So head over to Dehancer.com, use the discount code Mr. White and get a license for any desktop version of this plugin. In the next video, I will be creating more tutorials on how to use Dehancer on each of the different levels of customization, and also the Dehancer mobile app, and for other pieces of software that is not just video but also for image processing. So with that said, we're gonna cut it here. Thank you so much for joining, and I see you on the next video. Make sure to subscribe and stay tuned for more videos about the cinematic look.